Um, Thank you all again for being here. It's so exciting to see everybody, and I'm so excited to share this with you. So again, this morning I'm presenting on the gendered reality of climate change. So to start off with, I'll tell you all a little bit more about me. So I'm Ginny. I really grew up in these kind of little pockets of nature that dotted my neighborhood. And I spent like every recess in elementary school catching grasshoppers in the little patch of prairie next to like our playground. And now though I wonder, like, are all of these little pockets still going to be there in like 20, 30 or 40 years? I'm really part of this generation that looks at climate change projections and sees the worst effects like squarely in my lifetime. And that's really scary. It scares me because I know that like everyone is going to be affected by climate change, but also that some are going to be affected more than others. It makes me scared because I hope to have my own family one day, and like I'm worried my kids won't have access to like spaces where they can catch grasshoppers and peer at them in between like their little fingers. And I'm worried because I'm a woman and I might have daughters, and women are being disproportionately affected by climate change. And so all of this kind of makes this morning and this topic like more than just a topic for a presentation, but it's really like our futures and our lives. And this is just like a little bit more for you all like about me and why I'm here. So now let's get into thinking about gender and climate change on sort of a broader scale. Before I dive too much into things though, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that I'm going to be using binary gendered language throughout this presentation. However, like I know that gender is not a binary and that we all experience gender differently, and there are a whole plethora of ways that people identify with their gender, but the available research on how gender relates to climate change is very binary. And this is like problematic in its own ways because it means we don't really understand how climate change is going to affect people who exist outside of that like gender binary. And it just means that there's a lot of people who are sort of falling through the cracks of this research, and limits the types of conversations that we can have on it. But just wanted to say that to you all before we dive into it. But yeah, from rising sea levels to agricultural shortfalls to extreme disasters like hurricanes and wildfires and droughts, we're already experiencing the devastating effects of climate change. And these impacts are only going to grow. By 2030, it's estimated that 250,000 additional deaths per year over like a base average are going to be attributed to climate change. And so climate change is affecting every part of our planet and all of our basic necessities, from food to air to water to disease. And so it's affecting everybody. However, while everyone is experiencing and at risk of climate change, we aren't all experiencing it equally. Many factors, including who you are, where you live, what your job is, what community you live in, and like how much money you make, is all going to determine like how you're affected by climate change. And one of these factors of your gender makes climate change not gender neutral. Around the world, men and women experience life differently due to gendered norms, laws, and institutions. And gender not only affects our day-to-day lives, but it's also affecting how we interact with the environment and are going to experience and be affected by climate change. In most parts of the world, and especially in rural communities, women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. However, this doesn't mean that women are inherently vulnerable. There's nothing about women that would say that. Instead, this disproportionate impact is a result of intersecting power structures and socioeconomic characteristics. For example, social norms have led to limited like livelihood and job options for women. And many of those that like are accessible to women are going to depend on some of those resources that are most affected by climate change. One of the easiest ways to see like these gendered impacts is in agriculture. Women produce 50 to 80% of the world's food, but only make up about 10% of landowners. So women farmers are not able to access the same resources or support as men, as well as not having access to like owning their land. if women farmers had access to the same like resources and support, whether like material or like training and things, they could increase agricultural yields by over 30%. And this would feed up to 150 million more people who currently like don't have access to that stable and secure food sources. And then in non-rural areas, food is still one of the like easy ways to see how climate change impacts us by gender, because women are often expected to be the primary purchasers of food. So they're the ones who are going to like most immediately face shortages at the supermarket and having to make really tough decisions on how to spend like the money that they have for groceries, as prices and availability fluctuate super dramatically as we experience like shortages and interruptions to like global supply chains. And additionally, because of like gender norms as caregivers and providers, women and girls are more likely to go hungry than men and boys when food shortages are experienced. They're going to be the people who are the last to eat are women over like the men and boys in the same household. And so when you have climate change leading to increases in events like extreme droughts, which threatens agricultural production, or like I said before, can interrupt these international food systems that we rely on, shortages are going to be more likely and more pronounced. And these shortages are always going to disproportionately affect women and girls around the world. In addition to like effects related to food and being primarily agricultural producers, women and girls are often responsible for collecting water and gathering fuel for heating and cooking in communities that depend on this. And with climate change, these resources like water and like wood are going to become scarcer and scarcer. And this will require women and girls to spend more time and energy traveling to access this limited supply. Globally, women are responsible for like anywhere from 2/3 to up to 80% of water collection for households that are fetching water. And already 3 billion people live with water scarcity. And by 2030, we know that our global demand for water is expected to outstrip the supply. And so this is only going to dramatically increase the number of people who are facing water scarcity and water shortages. And like collecting fuel depends on forests and woodlands, which are facing like dramatic rates of deforestation and desertification, and it's making these areas much scarcer and much smaller and often farther away from the communities that are depending on them. And as women and girls travel on these elongated routes and spend more time gathering resources, they're also at heightened risk of gender-based violence, including sexual violence. And we're already starting to see that in communities like these refugee camps that are like in areas that have a lot of scarcity for fuel and water, that there's lots of like high rates of gender-based violence as women and girls are on these like elongated paths to like retrieve these resources. So one of the other like major ways that we see climate change manifesting already is in extreme weather events and disasters. Climate change makes these more intense and more frequent, everything from floods and droughts to tsunamis to heat waves or hurricanes or polar vortexes. All these like massive weather events are getting more dramatic and are happening more often. And these extreme weather events are disproportionately impacting the poor and the most vulnerable. And 70% of what's considered the world's poor are women. And so this is all going to disproportionately impact women. In disasters in Asia, which have been really studied for their gendered impacts, women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men. In a 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh, 91% of the deaths were women. And during the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia, 4 times more women died than men. And this is because of like their family and childcare expectations, where like in Indonesia, women spent way more time trying to like help gather children and elders and like other people who were struggling to leave. And so it slowed like their efforts to flee and led to like a lot higher death rates. So again, showing how those like gendered norms of how you spend your time and what you're doing really affect like how you're impacted by these disasters. And this isn't just something that's found in like Asia. In the recent heat waves that spread across Europe just a few years ago, women were more likely to die than men in Paris and 9 other European cities. And so on top too of being dramatically more likely to die in these like extreme weather events, women make up 80% of people who are displaced by disasters and extreme weather events. Oftentimes these displaced people are referred to as climate refugees. So people who can no longer live in their communities or even their countries because of the like direct threat that they face from climate change. And the number of people who are displaced in this way is expected to absolutely skyrocket in the next few decades. And estimates range anywhere from like, I think it's like 100 million to over 2 billion people that will be displaced. And like already millions of people are displaced every year, and recognizing that 80% of these are people who are being displaced are women. And again, when women and children are like displaced, they're disproportionately facing gender-based violence and human rights abuses in like refugee camps and in like the migrant paths that they're traveling as they're trying to like get somewhere safe and that's not being threatened by like these disasters. So similar to what I've just been talking about for a lot of the last slides, most of the time when gender and climate is talked about, the conversation really focuses on countries in the global south. And that's like, yeah, just what most of the statistics that I've talked about of extremely rural populations or some of the countries that I named. But it's important to recognize that gender affects how we experience climate change everywhere. So I'm going to push you all to think a little bit about some of the gendered norms that we experience in our daily lives in the US and how they may change how we're affected by climate change. So feel free to put any thoughts that you have of sort of like what are some gendered expectations for how like we go about our lives that you think might interact with like climate change for us in the US. You can throw it in the chat or in like the Q&A and I'll be able to see either one, and then we'll talk about it a little more. Okay, perfect. I'm having a couple things come in from people, so we'll go ahead and hop to the next part. You can feel free to keep sending things too. But just some examples of like from what some of you were talking about, people brought up like hurricanes as one of the major like displacing disasters that we experience in the United States. And yeah, women, for like one example, women were dramatically more likely to be stranded in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina than men. And additionally, thinking about some of these like longer term impacts in addition to that like immediate like stranding and displacement is that women lost 7% of their earnings for the next year in New Orleans, and men had average gains of 23%. And this is because there was like shifts in demands for which industries that were like being needed. So like the male dominated fields of like construction were super in need after you had like massive communities experience these like damages from the hurricane, versus like some of the women dominated fields were like the ones that they had their businesses destroyed and there was less reliance on it then. So and like already we think about the gender pay gap and how like women are making less than men before this disaster, and then they lost a lot of wages while men were actually seeing like increased demands on average. And so it just shows like hurricanes, for one example, are not only in the US impacting women more in who is displaced and who gets stranded, but then also having these like splintering effects into like interacting with the gender pay gaps and the gendered work roles that we like experience. And then also with like childcare and household like providing, which is another one that people were sharing, that women are expected to do more of the work to raise children and to do like the domestic aspects of like buying groceries and things. And so as women are expected to be primary caregivers for children and other relatives and like the primary household like purchasers to like buy food and do like cooking and cleaning and things, it adds up to women making like the majority of consumer purchases in North America. And all of these different pieces, from raising children to caring for elders, to like I talked about before, like buying groceries and experiencing like food scarcities and things, like these activities are going to be dramatically affected by climate change. And like their women are responsible for taking care of others in these extreme weather events, and like potentially putting themselves like at heightened risk by having that responsibility. But then also they're like bearing the like they're bearing like the brunt of these burdens of caring for people who are going to be having like additional health risks. Like you think of increased rates of asthma and increased like stress on people's bodies from like especially old people's bodies as they live through these extreme weather events. Like women are going to be disproportionately like having to like put more time into that as that happens as well. And then thinking about heat waves kind of throws a little bit of a twist into this narrative that in the United States, men are actually 2.6 times more likely to die in heat waves than women. But this again goes back to our gendered norms, and that gendered norms go both ways. They don't just affect women, but they also affect men. And men in the United States are way more likely to be isolated and spending long periods of time like outside and alone, especially older men. And so this is what puts them at this like way higher risk of like heat stress and heat death, as well as like men who are working really long hours in agricultural fields as like farm workers and things too. So again, like that point just really goes to show like gendered norms, well, climate change is disproportionately affecting women like around the world. Gendered norms are really like they affect everyone, and they can have these like both ways impacts as well. So then kind of thinking about what can we do, I've given a lot of pretty, I don't know, overwhelming or kind of scary statistics of how these like disproportionate impacts are going to play out. But then thinking about sort of some of the hope and some of what comes from this. And so we need to not just recognize that climate change is disproportionately affecting women around the world, but also recognizing that gender needs to influence and like affect how we respond. So more than 70% of women and girls around the world experience what are classified as like high levels of gender inequities. But virtually all women are going to experience gender inequity to some extent. And so researchers are starting to find time and time again that improvements in gender equality and gender equity contribute directly to climate resilience, and that these improvements benefit everyone in society and not just women and girls. And so increasing women and girls' access to education at like secondary school and higher levels is the #1 factor that actually reduces vulnerability to disasters, which I just talked about. Like 80% of those displaced in disasters are women and girls. And like it doesn't only like decrease their risk of like death and displacement, but it also can decrease the risk for everyone else in the community as they help like everybody to handle these disasters and respond to them. Education, access to education also affects like health outcomes and life expectancy for women and girls and their economic opportunities. And like a recent study even found that these women empowerment packages of like education and health and economic opportunities all together are like the policies that would have the #1 biggest impact on climate change, even more so than like renewable energy policies. So it's just going to show like recognizing gender and its importance in like responding to climate change. And in addition to these policies, we're also finding that like while women are disproportionately affected by climate change around the world, they're rarely represented in government or in industry leadership, and only about 12% of environmental ministers and like state heads around the world are women, and less than 1/4 of the renewable energy workforce is made up of women, and very few of the women that are in this workforce are in like management and executive positions. And however, despite like the fact that they haven't been very well represented in the past, when women are in these leadership roles and in these power positions, they make really positive differences in the fight against climate change. Countries with more women in parliament are significantly more likely to support international agreements on climate change and to push for more aggressive climate policies in their country. And increases in women political leadership is like directly tied to decreases in a country's emissions. And so one study found that if you increased the like representation of women in the highest levels of government by 10%, it decreases the carbon emissions of that country to the equivalent of if every single American drove their car 587 miles less in a year. And so that's just like huge amounts of like decreases per capita, like around the world, as we have more women in like these leadership roles. And so that kind of like ties me to this last piece that's like, we need to really consider gender, because study after study is starting to show how important it is not just to recognize that gender affects how we are experiencing climate change and are being affected by it, but it also like really affects how we're able to respond and how we're able to build these adaptive and resilient communities. So climate change research and policies need to consider gender as this influential factor. And if policies are gender blind, they're just going to exacerbate the existing inequalities and the issues that we spent sort of the first chunk of this thinking about. And then also like vote. In the US, we get to choose our representatives through voting, and this action against climate change and electing these leaders that are going to prioritize that and prioritize these types of like gender conscious policies matters, whether it's a local level, a state level, a national level, or even like on these international stages of agreements and things. And like you can influence that with like your political voice and your vote, and letting your representatives know that this is the stuff that you care about and these are the things that you like want them to prioritize as well. And then lastly, like one of the most important things is to talk about people or talk to people. For a long time, like I knew that climate change was something that we were experiencing, and it was something that I've been passionate about, but I had no idea that it was going to disproportionately affect people in different ways to the extent that it is. And that, yeah, well, it's affecting all of us. It's affecting us so differently that it's kind of insane that we aren't having these conversations and aren't like considering this. And so we can take a lot of like we can do a lot by just like talking to each other and things, and talking about climate change generally, and then also recognizing these like disproportionate impacts that it has on different people, and helping to kind of spread the word and make it so that we're all more aware and all able to start calling for these like broader and bigger policies to make those like large scale changes that we need. And so I kind of challenge you to like talk to a few people in your life, whether it's your friends or your family or your roommates or coworkers or anything, and talk about something that like you learned from this presentation, and spark that conversation and spark that interest in somebody else, because we all need to sort of recognize it and learn about it and able to even like make the changes that we need to. And so with that, thank you all so much for joining me this morning, and I really hope that this is just like the start of this conversation about climate change and how it affects us differently based on our identities. If you're curious, in my like virtual booth, I have a document with more like videos and articles about like the gendered realities of climate change. And then also I put my email on here. You can always feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk more about this than I had a chance to. And yeah, if anyone has any questions they want to ask though right now, you can feel free to ask. Put them in either the Q&A section or the chat, and I will answer them. But again, thank you all for coming, and you are free to go or stick around. I know I have one question that asks about thinking about potentially the reproductive repercussions of climate change, thinking about the fashion industry. This person says that they know that most factories are extremely dangerous with nasty chemicals and are mostly staffed by women, which can lead to birth defects and reproductive issues. So for that, I would say, yeah, that a lot of the things that are driving climate change, from industrial pollution to the like corporations that are like predominantly responsible. Most of the chemicals that they're using that are contributing a lot to greenhouse gases and broader global warming are also chemicals that have really nasty effects on our bodies. And this is true not only in like the fashion industry and the chemicals that are used there, but also in things like fracking and the production of like natural gas. The types of chemical soup that they end up producing leads to really high rates of like breast cancer and cervical cancer too. And so I think that there's sort of like direct ties between the reproductive repercussions and sort of these broader gendered impacts of thinking of who's being the most affected by like what we're doing and then what's coming from that. And that broader climate change and then these specific like birth defects and reproductive issues tied to like chemicals are both kind of rooted back to the same systems that we have of like international commerce and these large corporations and things that are using these chemicals. And so it kind of ties to like, what do we need to change to regulate those chemicals, to push for different business practices, to not only like limit those direct effects of chemicals on people's bodies, but then also the effects of chemicals on like our broader environment and the big giant scale like global climate changes that come from that as well. So it's all tied together, which is part of what can make this seem really daunting as something to start tackling and talking about, but also what makes it such an important conversation and something that like we need to be talking about more than we already are. But yes, thank you all for coming. If anyone else has any questions, again, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A or email me afterwards. I'm always happy to talk more about this, and I know I could just go on forever about climate change and gender. But yes, thank you. I'm so excited to have gotten to share this all with you this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.